Good. Okay. Looks like I'm live. Fancy that. Technology is working. Um, I am very lucky in my life that I have been able to come across so many documents from the women's liberation movement and just feminist texts in general, and that, I cut my teeth and learned developed most of my understanding reading stuff that was written in like the 60s and 70s. And one of the early books that I read, or, mostly read, I should say, was the book Woman's Evolution by Evelyn Reed. I don't really want to get into that right now, actually. That might be a subject for another video, but I, knew who she was because of that. And recently I was at a bookstore and came across this treasure, but I actually have not actually read this one yet. So I figured what we could do tonight is that I would kind of be here with you and flip through it together and maybe read a little bit together and kind of discover this piece together, because it looks really interesting. So the title of this book is Problems of Women's Liberation. It's rather thin, and I'm going to show you the back here. There's a little bit of damage, unfortunately, and I found out that, or on the inside cover, this is apparently the fourth publishing of the book. It was first written in 1969, which I think is relevant because that was a really important time in terms of women's liberation. And it definitely is going to be critiquing a lot of the things that were happening culturally within the movement. So let's look at the back. I'll read this to you. Evelyn Reed explores the economic and social roots of sexism in modern society, contrasting male and female roles today with the leading part played by women in ancient societies. So Evelyn Reed was an anthropologist, and she very strongly believed that society had been matriarchal at a point, and that basically women were, our role as leaders in society was usurped by men. And as a Marxist, she really ties that into the development of private property. And in many ways, I do think that the development of private property is one of the strongest ways that patriarchy has inserted its influence. But as a radical feminist, I think what we get down to ultimately, and the kind of distinction between someone like Evelyn Reed and myself, would be analyzing male violence, and specifically the sexual role difference that is played out by men and women, specifically with women taking on a reproductive function within patriarchy. So women become property themselves and then are thus turned into a means of reproduction, or ourselves, however you want to look at it. Although you can resist, and many of us have. So published in many languages and widely used. My cat is going ape in the background with his toy, so if you hear any bells, that's him. Published in many languages and widely used in women's studies courses, this popular book is a rich contribution to the feminist discussion of women's oppression and how to end it. Evelyn Reed is a Marxist writer and lecturer on anthropology, as well as an active socialist and feminist. She is the author of Women's Evolution: From Matriarchal Clan to Patriarchal Family, which was published by Pathfinder in 1975. And it also says this book is available in cloth at $6. Unfortunately, I don't know what the original cost of the book was. Somebody took a Sharpie and scribbled over it. So unfortunately, we don't know. But yeah, let's dig in. It's glorious. I love these old kind of sleek booklets. They're one of my, coming across these, they're always cheap when you find them. And they're just so lovely. Like, just as you open it up, look at that. Don't you just want to dig into that? So here's the contents. We have the foreword, note to the second edition, and then we get into the writings. Women and the Family, a historical view. The myth of women's inferiority. How women lost control of their destiny and how they can regain it. Women, caste, class, or oppressed sex. Oh, I think we should read that one. Hello, Lady Solidarity. Thank you for being here. Cosmetics, fashions, the exploitation of women. Fashions and the exploitation of women. Oh, okay. I think we should read these two. And then the end is the Feminine Mystique, which I'm also curious about. I don't know how many of you have read the Feminine Mystique, but might be something interesting to see what she has to say. So let's go to, I guess, page 64 and check it out. Actually, let's read the foreword first. Here, I'm going to flip this around. After years of lethargy and submission to the status quo, more and more American women have aroused themselves and are joining rebellious blacks and student radicals in contesting the capitalist establishment. This vanguard is calling for an end to the second-class status of our sex. The new breed of militant women is submitting the institutions and values of today's society to scathing criticism. Their challenges range from the discrimination practiced against the female sex in employment to the reactionary abortion laws upheld by church and state. The women's liberation groups springing up around this struggle for equality are earnestly debating the various problems of theory and action it presents, just as Afro-Americans are striving to find out why they were thrust into servitude and how they can speedily free themselves. So do these newly awakened women want to know how and why they have become subjugated to male rule and what can be done about it. However, when they go in search of explanations, they discover to their dismay how little information is available on this score. There are many works that trace the development of mankind without distinction of sex, from the earliest times to the present. But where will the inquirer find a reliable summary of the evolution of women which can shed light upon the puzzling questions of their changing social status through the ages? The paucity of data on this subject is of utmost concern to half of the human race, should not come as a surprise. History up to now has been written primarily from the standpoint of the master classes and the master sex. So it is that a full accounting of the contributions of women to social progress has yet to be made. The true record of their accomplishments has been scanted, underrated, and distorted in the same manner and for much the same reasons as the trials and triumphs of the laboring population and oppressed minorities have been neglected. All sections of the oppressed, including the women, are now being impelled to write and rewrite their own histories, to bring them out of concealment and correct the falsifications. And they must do this work in the very heat of their struggle for emancipation and as an instrument of it. A comprehensive history of womankind must necessarily begin far back with the origins of society. The earliest period of time, savagery, is, or should be, the special province of anthropology among the sciences. As the study of prehistory or pre-civilization, anthropology has the greatest relevance to the woman question. As I sought to indicate, its findings, properly interpreted and understood, can shatter many of the prevailing myths and prejudices about women and provide a valuable means of helping the liberation movement. For example, women in pre-civilized society were both economically independent and sexually free. They did not depend upon husbands, fathers, or male employers for their livelihoods, and were not humble and grateful for whatever was thrown their way. In their communal society, they worked together with other women and men for the benefit of the whole community and shared the proceeds of their labors on an equal basis. In accord with their custom, they decided for themselves the conduct of their sexual lives. Ancient women were not objects to be patronized, bullied, manipulated, and exploited. As producers and procreators, they were the acknowledged leaders in a matriarchal society and were held in the highest honor and respect by the men. However, when such facts were first disclosed by the pioneer anthropologists of the last century, these insights into the earliest forms of social organization offended and alarmed the guardians of the status quo, as they do to this very day. Their objections have had adverse effects upon the subsequent development of science and anthropology, and, by the same token, have served to deter and delay the production of a complete and authentic history of women. There are political reasons for this stubborn resistance. The discovery that women have not always been the second sex, occupying a downtrodden status, but on the contrary, once displayed immense creative, social, and cultural capacities, contained dangerously subversive implications. It threatened to undermine both male supremacy and capitalist domination. For if it was true that the female sex had played the cardinal part in building that early communal society, why could they not do as well in reconstructing social relations on a higher historical level? Once the frustrated and rebellious women of today learned what their female ancestors had performed in their time and what an influential position they had held, they would hardly be content to remain in their present inferiority. Participants in the women's liberation movements would not only be encouraged, but far better equipped to engage in the struggles for the abolition of capitalist society, which keeps them down, and for the building of a new and better society, where all people and both sexes would be free. The writings of the founders of scientific socialism, Marx and Engels, and of their disciples pointed in that direction. They taught that the oppression and degradation inflicted on women today could not be separated from the exploitation of the working masses by the capitalist profiteers. Therefore, women could secure full control over their lives and reshape their destinies only as an integral force in the world socialist revolution. This is the viewpoint of the writings in this pamphlet, most of which have been previously published. They are a small contribution to the tremendous task that awaits the women of our revolutionary epoch. In making our present and future history, we will have to reconstruct our past history, no matter how difficult that may be. As the current reawakening proceeds, I have no doubt that more and more women will critically review the long march of mankind, make new discoveries, and disseminate what is already known about the true history of our sex. June 15th, 1969, Evelyn Reed. So what did we say? We're going to go to 64 and read from there. I just saw something about Yeah, I just was glancing through that. There's some really interesting stuff in here. Women, caste, class, or oppressed sex. Now, this is a pretty controversial subject, so I thought it would be interesting to read what she has to say about it. And I see my cat getting into mischief, so what are you doing? Okay. So, she has written here, this article was first printed in the International Socialist Review of September 1970. I wonder if I wonder if the pamphlet was smaller, you know, at the time. And then this was added on because the book was published in 1969, right? So maybe they added this article, or maybe she just didn't get it published until after. Maybe not, actually. I mean, it says first printed. Get down, you're not allowed up there. Damn, dude. What do you all think so far? Let me read the comments before I dig into this. There is sadness that it all still applies today. I mean, sometimes when I read these older works and I think about, let's see, 1969, right? That was a long time ago. That was over 50 years ago, right? It's interesting how we continually, as radicals, as leftists, as feminists, whatever, this is the consistent thing, but specifically as women, specifically as feminists, our history is continually buried. Like, it's completely a mystery to us. And I tell you, I can't tell you the number of women who I've spoken to who have like no comprehension of the fact that we're just erased. We are just erased. I think if women had any idea how much work, I think, and how much energy went into like the production of things like this. I mean, this pamphlet here, this could not exist outside of a movement, you know? This couldn't exist outside of like an epoch, as she called it. So, I don't know. It is sad, I guess, but it's also kind of encouraging because you see like all of the ways in which we're divided, like along age, really don't matter, okay? And because we're going through the same shit ultimately. Like, not a lot has changed in that fact. And in some ways that's encouraging because if we can just uncover, if we can just dig, the theory is all there, you know? Everything you need to know is there. So let's dig into this. The new stage in the struggle for women's liberation already stands on a higher ideological level than did the feminist movement of the last century. Many of the participants today respect the Marxist analysis of capitalism and subscribe to Engels' classic explanation of the origins of women's oppression. It came about through the development of class society, founded upon the family, private property, and the state. But there still remain considerable misunderstandings and misinterpretations of Marxist positions, which have led some women who consider themselves radicals or socialists. Whoa, hey! God, I love cats. He doesn't give a fuck what we're doing. Typical male, right? Does not give a fuck. Okay. Who consider themselves radicals or socialists to go off course and become theoretically disoriented, influenced by the myth that women have always been handicapped by their childbearing functions. They tend to attribute the roots of women's oppression, at least in part, to biological sexual differences. In actuality, its causes are exclusively historical and social in character. So in this, she's setting up kind of her worldview, right? She's a socialist feminist or Marxist feminist. Anyway, let's continue. Some of these theorists maintain that women constitute a special class or caste. Such definitions are not only alien to the views of Marxism, but lead to the false conclusion that it is not the capitalist system, but men who are the prime enemy of women. I propose to challenge this contention. The findings of the Marxist method, which have laid the groundwork for explaining the genesis of women's degradation, can be summed up in the following propositions. First, women were not always the oppressed or second sex. Anthropology, or the study of prehistory, tells us the contrary. Throughout primitive society, which was the epoch of tribal collectivism, women were the equals of men and recognized by man as such. Second, the downfall of women coincided with the breakup of the matriarchal clan commune and its replacement by class-divided society with its institutions of the patriarchal family, private property, and state power. The key factors which brought about this reversal in women's social status came out of the transition from a hunting and food-gathering economy to a far higher mode of production based upon agriculture, stock raising, and urban crafts. The primitive division of labor between the sexes was replaced by a more complex social division of labor. The greater efficiency of labor gave rise to a sizable surplus product, which led first to differentiations and then to deep-going divisions among the various segments of society. By virtue of the directing roles played by men in large-scale agriculture, irrigation, and construction projects, as well as in stock raising, this surplus wealth was gradually appropriated by a hierarchy of men as their private property. This in turn required the institution of marriage and the family to fix the legal ownership and inheritance of a man's property. Through monogamous marriage, the wife was brought under the complete control of her husband, who was thereby assured of legitimate sons to inherit his wealth. As men took over most of the activities of social production, and with the rise of the family institution, women became relegated to the home to serve their husbands and families. The state apparatus came into existence to fortify and legalize the institutions of private property, male dominion, and the father family, which later were sanctified by religion. This briefly is the Marxist approach to the origin of woman's oppression. Her subordination did not come about through any biological deficiency as a sex. That's interesting, the deficiency. I always that's one that's little thing that sticks out to me, because while I do think that women's biology does, not just our biology, but male biology have a factor to play in what's happening to women, right? It's not that we're deficient, is it? I don't think it's that we are deficient, and I don't think, it's one of those words that it's well, who made the claim that we're deficient as such? I would say it's more that we are vulnerable than deficient. It was the result of the revolutionary changes which destroyed the egalitarian society of the matriarchal gens or clan and replaced it with a patriarchal class society, which from its birth was stamped with discriminations and inequalities of many kinds, including the inequality of the sexes. The growth of this inherently oppressive type of socioeconomic organization was responsible for the historic downfall of women. But the downfall of women cannot be fully understood, nor can a correct social and political solution be worked out for their liberation without seeing what happened at the same time to men. It is too often overlooked that the patriarchal class system, which crushed the matriarchy and its communal social relations, also shattered its male counterpart. She's calling it the fratriarchy, like from the Latin frater, brother, fratriarchy, or tribal brotherhood of men. Woman's overthrow went hand in hand with the subjugation of the mass of toiling men to the master class of men. The import of these developments can be more clearly seen if we examine the basic character of the tribal structure, which Morgan, Engels, and others described as a system of primitive communism. The clan commune was both a sisterhood of women and a brotherhood of men. The sisterhood of women, which was the essence of the matriarchy, denoted its collectivist character. The women worked together as a community of sisters. Their social labors largely sustained the whole community. They also raised their children in common. An individual mother did not draw distinctions between her own and her clan's sisters' progeny, and the children in turn regarded all the older sisters as their mutual mothers. In other words, communal production and communal possessions were accompanied by communal child raising. The male counterpart of this sisterhood was the brotherhood, which was molded in the same communal pattern as the sisterhood. Each clan or phratry of clans comprising the tribe was regarded as a brotherhood from the male standpoint, just as it was viewed as a sisterhood or motherhood from the female standpoint. In this matriarchal brotherhood, the adults of both sexes not only produced the necessities of life together, but also provided for and protected the children of the community. These features made the sisterhood and brotherhood a system of primitive communism. Thus, before the family that had the individual father standing at its head came into existence, the functions of fatherhood were a social and not a family function of men. More than this, the earliest men who performed the services of fatherhood were not the mates or husbands of the clan sisters, but rather their clan brothers. This was not simply because the processes of physiological paternity were unknown in ancient society. More decisively, this fact was irrelevant in a society founded upon collectivist relations of production and communal child raising. I'm going to pause here too and say that in some cultures, it is considered, like, children are considered to be communal, and like as an adult you are considered to be responsible for like any child. So this is a thing that does come up in certain societies, and I do think it has a lot to do with how they live and how they think of one another. And it also can be a result of survival too. With, let's say, subjugated like indigenous populations in the U.S., oftentimes like you do treat everyone like family in certain scenarios just because it is, or what we would like consider to be family, right? There's no concept that there's like a primacy there because the survival of everyone is important. And I think that's an attitude that many people would do well to adopt, because the coldness of the world is a very sad thing indeed. However odd it may seem to people today who are so accustomed to the family form of child raising, it was perfectly natural in the primitive commune for the clan brothers or mothers' brothers to perform the paternal functions for their sisters' children that were later taken over by the individual father for his wife's children. The first change in the sister-brother clan system came with the growing tendency for pairing couples, or pairing families, as Morgan and Engels called them, to live together in the same community and household. However, this simple cohabitation did not substantially alter the former collectivist relations or the productive role of the women in the community. The sexual division of labor, which had formerly been allotted between clan sisters and brothers, became gradually transformed into a sexual division of labor between husbands and wives. But so long as collectivist relations prevailed and women continued to participate in social production, the original equality between the sexes more or less persisted. The whole community continued to sustain the pairing units, just as each individual member of these units made his and her contribution to the labor activities. Consequently, the pairing family, which appeared at the dawn of the family system, differed radically from the nuclear family of our times. In our ruthless, competitive capitalist system, every tiny family must sink or swim through its own efforts. It cannot count on assistance from outside sources. The wife is dependent upon the husband, while the children must look to the parents for their subsistence. Even if the wage earners who support them are stricken by unemployment, sickness, or death. In the period of the pairing family, however, there was no such system of dependency upon family economics, since the whole community took care of each individual's basic needs from the cradle to the grave. This was the material basis for the absence in the primitive commune of those social oppressions and family antagonisms with which we are so familiar. It is sometimes said or implied that male domination has always existed and that women have always been brutally treated by men. Contrariwise, it is also widely believed that the relations between the sexes in matriarchal society were merely the reverse of our own, with women dominating men. Neither of these propositions is born out of the anthropological evidence. It is not my intention to glorify the epoch of savagery, nor advocate a romantic return to some past golden age. An economy founded upon hunting and food gathering is the lowliest stage of human development, and its living conditions were rude, crude, and harsh. Nevertheless, we must recognize that male and female relations in that kind of society were fundamentally different from ours. Under the clan system of the sisterhood of women and the brotherhood of men, there was no more possibility for one sex to dominate the other than there was for one class to exploit another. Women occupied the most eminent position because they were the chief producers of the necessities of life, as well as the procreators of new life. But this did not make them the oppressors of men. Their communal society excluded class, racial, or sexual tyranny. As Ingalls pointed out, with the rise of private property, monogamous marriage, and the patriarchal family, new social forces came into play in both society at large and the family setup, which destroyed the rights exercised by earliest womankind. From simple cohabitation of pairing couples, there arose the rigidly fixed legal system of monogamous marriage. This brought the wife and children under the complete control of the husband and father who gave the family his name and determined their conditions of life and destiny. Women who had once lived and worked together as a community of sisters and raised their children in common now became dispersed as wives of individual men, serving their lords and masters in individual households. The former equalitarian sexual division of labor between the men and women of the commune gave way to a family division of labor in which the woman was more and more removed from social production to serve as a household drudge for husband, home, and family. Thus, women, once governesses of society, were degraded under the class formations to become the governess of a man's children and his chief housemaid. This abasement of women has been a permanent feature of all three stages of class society, from savagery through feudalism to capitalism. So long as women led or participated in the productive work of the whole community, they commanded respect and esteem. But once they were dismembered into separate family units and occupied a servile position in home and family, they lost their prestige, along with their influence and power. No. Is it any wonder that such drastic social changes should bring about an intense and long-enduring antagonism between the sexes? As Ingalls says, monogamy then does by no means enter history as a reconciliation of man and wife, and still less as the highest form of marriage. On the contrary, it enters as the subjugation of one sex by the other, as the proclamation of an antagonism between the sexes unknown in all preceding history. The first-class antagonism appearing in history coincides with the development of the antagonism of man and wife in monogamy, and the first-class oppression with that of the female by the male sex. That is a direct quote from Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State by Friedrich Engels. Here it is necessary to note a distinction between two degrees of women's oppression in monogamous family life under the system of private property. In the productive farm family of the pre-industrial age, women held a higher status and were accorded more respect than they receive in the consumer family of our own city life, the nuclear family. So long as agriculture and craft industry remained dominant in the economy, the farm family, which was a large or extended family, remained a viable, productive unit. All its members had vital functions to perform according to sex and age. The women in the family helped cultivate the ground and engaged in home industries as well as bearing children, while the children and older folks produced their share according to ability. This changed with the rise of industrial and monopoly capitalism and the nuclear family. Once masses of men were dispossessed from the land and small businesses to become wage earners in factories, they had nothing but their labor power to sell to the capitalist bosses for their means of subsistence. I said, no, baby, come on. Come on. Let me take a break for a moment. Where was I? The wives of these wage earners ousted from their former productive farm and homecraft laborers became utterly dependent upon their husbands for the support of themselves and their children. As men became dependent upon their bosses, the wives became more dependent upon their husbands. I also want to just take a break here to also really drive home the point that the wives of men who sold their labor in factories were also working in factories themselves, but the degraded status of women had allowed for them to be paid so little comparatively that trying to survive outside of having a man on those factory wages was impossible. So they basically set up a system where they could exploit women's labor and also make them dependent on men at the same time, because men would just naturally command a higher wage. It was done intentionally by capitalists to divide the working class. I mean, that is something that we have to understand. Like, the people who benefit most by these antagonism between workers not being equal is bosses, ultimately. And I don't mean your direct boss. I mean who owns the company. By degrees, therefore, as women were stripped of their economic self-dependence, they fell ever lower in social esteem. At the beginning of class society, they had been removed from social production and social leadership to become farm family producers, working through their husbands for home and family. But with the displacement of the productive farm family by the nuclear family of industrial city life, they were driven from their last foothold on solid ground. Women were then given two dismal alternatives. They could either seek a husband as provider and be penned up thereafter as housewives in city tenements or apartments to raise the next generation of wage slaves, or the poorest and most unfortunate could go as marginal workers into the mills and factories along with the children and be sweated as the most downtrodden and underpaid section of the labor force. And to this day, the lowest paid workers in the world are women and children, working in factories, producing bullshit. Producing commodities. which a lot of which are just unnecessary. So it's a goddamn shame. Over the past generations, women wage workers have conducted their own labor struggles or fought along with men for improvements in their wages and working conditions. But women as dependent housewives have had no such means of social struggle. They could only resort to complaints or wrangles with husband and children over the miseries of their lives. The friction between the sexes became deeper and sharper with the abject dependency of women and their subservience to men. Despite the hypocritical homage paid to womankind as the sacred mother and devoted homemaker, the worth of women sank to its lowest point under capitalism. Since housewives do not produce commodities for the market nor create any surplus value for the profiteers, they are not central to the operations of capitalism. Only three justifications for their existence remain under the system: as breeders, as household janitors, and as buyers of consumer goods for the family. While wealthy women can hire servants to do the dull chores for them, poor women are riveted to an endless grind for their whole lives. Their condition of servitude is compounded when they are obliged to take an outside job to help sustain the family. Shouldering two responsibilities instead of one, they are the doubly oppressed. Even middle-class housewives in the Western world, despite their economic advantages, are victimized by capitalism. The isolated, monotonous, trivial circumstances of their lives lead them to living through their children, a relationship which fosters many of the neuroses that afflict family life today. Seeking to allay their boredom, they can be played upon and preyed upon by the profiteers in the consumer goods fields. This exploitation of women as consumers is part and parcel of a system that grew up in the first place for the exploitation of men as producers. The capitalists have ample reason for glorifying the nuclear family. Its petty household is a gold mine for all sorts of hucksters, from real estate agents to the manufacturers of detergents and cosmetics. Just as automobiles are produced for individual use, and instead of developing adequate mass transportation so the big corporations can make more money by selling small homes on private lots, to be equipped with individual washing machines, refrigerators, and other such items, they find this more profitable than building large-scale housing at low rentals or developing community services and child care centers. In the second place, the isolation of women, each enclosed in a private home and tied to the same kitchen and nursery chores, hinders them from banding together and becoming a strong social force or a serious political threat to the establishment. What is the most instructive lesson to be drawn from this highly condensed survey of the long imprisonment of womankind in the home and family of class society, which stands in such marked contrast to their stronger, more independent position in pre-class society? It shows that the inferior status of the female sex is not the result of their biological makeup or the fact that they are childbearers. Childbearing was no handicap in the primitive commune. It became a handicap, above all, in the nuclear family of our times. Poor women are torn apart by the conflicting obligations of taking care of their children at home, while at the same time working outside to help sustain the family. Women, then, have been condemned to their oppressed status by the same social forces and relations which have brought about the oppression of one class by another, one race by another, and one nation by another. It is the capitalist system, the ultimate stage of the development of class society, which is the fundamental source of the degradation and oppression of women. Some women in the liberation movement dispute these fundamental theses of Marxism. They say that the female sex represents a separate caste or class. T. Grace Atkinson, for example, takes the position that women are a separate class. Ooh, and she also mentions Roxanne Dunbar says that they comprise a separate caste. Let us examine these two theoretical positions and the conclusions that flow from them. First, are women a caste? The caste hierarchy came first in history and was the prototype and predecessor of the class system. It arose after the breakup of the tribal commune, with the emergence of the first marked differentiations of segments of society according to the new divisions of labor and social functions. Membership in a superior or inferior station was established by being born into that caste. It is important to note, however, that the caste system was also inherently and at birth a class system. Furthermore, while the caste system reached its fullest development only in certain regions of the world, such as India, the class system evolved far beyond it to become a world system, which engulfed the caste system. This can be clearly seen in India itself, where each of the four chief castes, the Brahmins or priests, the soldiers, the farmers and merchants, and the laborers, along with the outcasts or pariahs, had their appropriate places in an exploitative society. In India today, where the ancient caste system survives in decadent forms, capitalist relations and power prevail over all the inherited pre-capitalist institutions, including the caste relics. However, those regions of the world which advanced fastest and farthest on the road to civilization bypassed or overleaped the caste system altogether. Western civilization, which started with ancient Greece and Rome, developed from slavery through feudalism to the maturest state of class society, capitalism. Neither in the caste system nor the class system, nor in their combinations, have women comprised a separate caste or class. Women themselves have been separated into the various castes and classes which make up these social formations. The fact that women occupy an inferior status as a sex does not ipso facto make women either an inferior caste or class. Even in ancient India, women belonged to different castes, just as they belong to different classes in contemporary capitalist society. In one case, their social status was determined by birth into a caste. In the other, it is determined by their own, or their husband's wealth. But the two can be fused, for women as for men. Both sexes can belong to a superior caste and possess superior wealth, power, and status. What then does Roxanne Dunbar want to convey when she refers to all women, regardless of class, as comprising a separate caste? And what consequences for action does she draw from this characterization? The exact content of both her premise and her conclusions are not clear to me, and perhaps to many others. They therefore deserve closer examination. Speaking in a loose and popular way, it is possible to refer to women as an inferior caste, as is sometimes done when they are also called slaves or serfs, when the intent is merely to indicate that they occupy the subordinate position in male-dominated society. The use of the term caste would then only expose the impoverishment of our language, which has no special word to indicate womankind as the oppressed sex. But more than this seems to be involved. If we judge from the paper by Roxanne Dunbar dated February 1970, which supersedes her previous positions on this question. In that document, she says that her characterization of women as an exploited caste is nothing new, that Marx and Engels likewise analyze the position of the female sex in just such a way. This is simply not the case. Neither Marx in Capital, nor Engels in The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, nor in any writings by noted Marxists, from Lenin to Luxemburg on this matter, has woman been defined by virtue of her sex as a caste. Therefore, this is not a mere verbal squabble over a misuse of a term, it is a distinct departure from Marxism, though presented in the name of Marxism. I would like clarification from Roxanne Dunbar on the conclusions she draws from her theory. For if all women belong to an inferior caste and all men belong to the superior caste, it would consistently follow that the central axis of this struggle for liberation would be a caste war of all women against all men, to bring about the liberation of women. This conclusion would seem to be confirmed by her statement that we live under an international caste system. This assertion is equally non-Marxist. What Marxists say is that we live under an international class system, And they further state that it will require not a caste war, but a class struggle of all the oppressed, male and female alike, to consummate women's liberation along with the liberation of all the oppressed masses. Does Roxanne Dunbar agree or disagree with this viewpoint on the paramount role of the class struggle? Her confusion points up the necessity for using precise language in a scientific exposition. However downtrodden women are under capitalism, they are not chattel slaves any more than they are feudal serfs or members of an inferior caste. The social categories of slave, serf, and caste refer to stages and features of past history and do not correctly define the position of women in our society. If we are to be precise and scientific, women should be defined as an oppressed sex. Turning to the other position, it is even more incorrect to characterize women as a special class. In Marxist sociology, a class is defined in two interrelated ways: by the role it plays in the processes of production, and by the stake it has in the ownership of property. Thus, the capitalists are the major power in our society because they own the means of production, and thereby control the state and direct the economy. The wage workers who create the wealth own nothing but their labor power, which they have to sell to the bosses in order to stay alive. Where do women stand in relation to these polar class forces? They belong to all strata of the social pyramid. The few at the top are part of the plutocratic class. More among us belong to the middle class. Most of us belong to the proletarian layers of the population. There is an enormous spread from the few wealthy women of the Rockefeller, Morgan, and Ford families to the millions of poor women who subsist on welfare dole. In short, women, like men, are a multi-class sex. This is not an attempt to divide women from one another, but simply to recognize the actual divisions that exist. The notion that all women as a sex have more in common than do members of the same class with one another is false. Upper-class women are not simply bedmates of their wealthy husbands. As a rule, they have more compelling ties which bind them together. They are economic, social, and political bedmates, united in defense of private property, profiteering, militarism, racism, and the exploitation of other women. To be sure, there can be individual exceptions to this rule, especially among young women today. We remember that Mrs. Frank Leslie, for example, left a $2 million bequest to further the cause of women's suffrage, and other upper-class women have devoted their means to secure civil rights for our sex. But it is quite another matter to expect any large number of wealthy women to endorse or support a revolutionary struggle which threatens their capitalist interests and privileges. Most of them scorn the liberation movement, saying openly or implicitly, "What do we need to be liberated from?" Is it really necessary to stress this point? Tens of thousands of women went to the Washington anti-war demonstrations in November 1969 and again in May 1970. Did they have more in common with the militant men marching beside them on that life and death issue, or with Mrs. Nixon, her daughters, and the wife of the Attorney General, Mrs. Mitchell, who peered uneasily out of her window and saw the specter of another Russian Revolution in those protesting masses? Will the wives of bankers, generals, corporation lawyers, and big industrialists be firmer allies of women fighting for liberation than working class men, black and white, who are fighting for theirs? Won't there be both men and women on both sides of the class struggle? If not, is the struggle to be directed against men as a sex rather than against the capitalist system? It is true that all forms of class society have been male-dominated and that men are trained from the cradle to be chauvinistic. But it is not true that men as such represent the main enemy of women. This crosses out multitudes of downtrodden, exploited men who are themselves oppressed by the main enemy of women, which is the capitalist system. These men likewise have a stake in the liberation struggle of the women. They can and will become our allies. Need a moment. What do you all think so far? I see that there's lots of nice comments. And their Transhumanist Cult Awareness Network says there was an episode of the original Star Trek where Spock mentions matriarchal history of the Earth. That's interesting. I do not watch Star Trek, or I don't watch most things. Like, I'm very particular, but that's one that I just have never been able to get into. Although I did try once. Oh, and Lady Solidarity had said something like, yes, I feel that is why so many parents have difficulty raising their children, which I assume is related to the section on communal child rearing, which I think we found all pretty compelling. And I think is what's needed, honestly, you know. Children as private property is like a real issue. Anyway. Yeah, I just need a moment of like reading like men will become our allies. I'm just like, oh, okay. Although the struggle against male chauvinism is an essential part of the task that women must carry out through their liberation movement, it is incorrect to make that the central issue. This tends to conceal or overlook the role of the ruling powers who not only breed and benefit from all forms of discrimination and oppression, but are also responsible for breeding and sustaining male chauvinism. Let us remember that male supremacy did not exist in the primitive commune, founded upon sisterhood and brotherhood. Sexism, like racism, has its roots in the private property system. A false theoretical position easily leads to a false strategy in the struggle for women's liberation. Such is the case with a segment of the Red Stockings who state in their manifesto that women are an oppressed class. If all women compose a class, then all men must form a counterclass, the oppressor class. What conclusion flows from this premise? That there are no men in the oppressed class? Where does this leave the millions of oppressed white working men who, like the oppressed blacks, Chicanas, and other minorities, are exploited by the monopolists? Don't they have a central place in the struggle for social revolution? At what point and under what banner do these oppressed peoples of all races and both sexes join together for common action against their common enemy? To oppose women as a class against men to oppose women as a class against men as a class can only result in diversion of the real class struggle. Isn't there a suggestion of this same line in Roxanne Dunbar's assertion that female liberation is the basis for social revolution? This is far from Marxist strategy, since it turns the real situation on its head. Marxists say that the social revolution is the basis for full female liberation, just as it is the basis for the liberation of the whole working class. In the last analysis, the real allies of women's liberation are all those forces which are impelled for their own reasons to struggle against and throw off the shackles of the imperialist masters. The underlying source of women's oppression, which is capitalism, cannot be abolished by women alone, nor by a coalition of women drawn from all classes. It will require a worldwide struggle for socialism by the working masses, female and male alike, together with every other section of the oppressed, to overthrow the power of capitalism, which is centered today in the United States. In conclusion, we must ask, what are the connections between the struggle for women's liberation and the struggle for socialism? First, even though the full goal of women's liberation cannot be achieved short of the socialist revolution, this does not mean that the struggle to secure reforms must be postponed until then. It is imperative for Marxist women to fight shoulder to shoulder with all our embattled sisters in organized actions for specific objectives from now on. This has been our policy ever since the new phase of the women's liberation movement surfaced a year or so ago, and even before. The women's movement begins, like other movements for liberation, by putting forward elementary demands. These are equal opportunities with men in education and jobs, equal pay for equal work, free abortions on demand, and child care centers financed by the government but controlled by the community. Mobilizing women behind these issues not only gives us the possibility of securing some improvements, but also exposes, curbs, and modifies the worst aspects of our subordination in this society. Second, why do women have to lead their own struggles for liberation, even though in the end the combined anti-capitalist offensive of the whole working class will be required for the victory of the socialist revolution? The reason is that no segment of society which has been subjected to oppression, whether it consists of third world people or of women, can delegate the leadership and promotion of their fight for freedom to other forces, even though other forces can act as their allies. We reject the attitude of some political tendencies that say they are Marxists but refuse to acknowledge that women have to lead and organize their own independent struggle for emancipation, just as they cannot understand why blacks must do the same. The maxim of the Irish revolutionist, "Who would be free themselves must strike the blow," fully applies to the cause of women's liberation. Women must themselves strike the blows to gain their freedom. And this holds true after the anti-capitalist revolution triumphs as well as before. In the course of our struggle, and as part of it, we will re-educate men who have been brainwashed into believing that women are naturally the inferior sex due to some flaws in their biological makeup. Men will have to learn that, in the hierarchy of oppressions created by capitalism, their chauvinism and dominance is another weapon in the hands of the master class for maintaining its rule. The exploited worker, confronted by the even worse plight of his dependent housewife, cannot be complacent about it. He must be made to see the source of the oppressive power that has degraded them both. Finally, to say that women form a separate class, or caste or class, must logically lead to the extremely pessimistic conclusions with regard to the antagonism between the sexes, in contrast with the revolutionary optimism of the Marxists. For unless the two sexes are to be totally separated, or the men liquidated, it would seem that they will have to remain forever at war with each other. As Marxists, we have a more realistic and hopeful message. We deny that women's inferiority was predestined by her biological makeup or has always existed. Far from being internal, women's subjugation and the bitter hostility between the sexes are no more than a few thousand years old. They were produced by the drastic social changes which brought the family, private property, and the state into existence. This view of history points to the necessity for a no less quite an interesting siren in the background, isn't it? This view of history points up the necessity for a no less thoroughgoing revolution in socio-economic relations to uproot the causes of inequality and achieve full emancipation for our sex. This is the purpose and promise of the socialist program, and this is what we are fighting for. I'm going to take a little break here and stretch for a moment. So let me read your comments. It makes me think about how women of certain classes come to relate to certain groups of men more than they do with certain groups of women, given that one's interactions and perspective are most likely to be limited in their position, with their beliefs and views on self, which are formed in relation to their background. Globalization is an element that complicates the process in that context amidst all the conveniences and efficiency which those with possible gains claim. So much of what separates us is about class as women, and it's a big elephant in the room, you know. A lot of the inability to even relate, I think, has to do with class, and it's not something that's really talked about much. I have made attempts to talk about it in the past, but I mean, women of different classes have different behaviors even, and it's different cultural or cultural differences, which can make relating difficult as well, but also just ways of viewing the world. And in my experience, women that are upper class tend to not really have revolutionary tendencies. Not always, but mostly no. There's just no recognition of the necessity of a revolutionary ethic. Okay. Well, Shannon liked the idea that we should liquidate men. Yes. All right, so this next section that I wanted to check out, page 77, nice, is on cosmetics, fashions, and the exploitation of women. So I think this will be interesting. Many issues being raised by the women's liberation movement today were anticipated by discussions which took place in the early 1950s. Among these were the questions of cosmetics and other beauty aids, as well as fashions. One such discussion on these issues took place in the Socialist Workers' Party in 1954. Some women felt that cosmetics and fashions were essential in the interest of improving the appearance of women and therefore upheld their use as one of women's rights. Others, however, felt that while every woman should have the right to dress as she pleased and use cosmetics as she wished, the reality had little to do with choice, but rather with a subtle social compulsion. Women in this ruthlessly competitive capitalist system were in fact obliged to make cosmetics and the latest fashions. Thus, women were being exploited as sex objects by the manufacturers of cosmetics and fashions in an industry which was established in the first place for multi-billions in profits and not in the interest of women's beauty. The following is the author's contribution to the discussion. The myth has arisen that, since all women want to be beautiful, they all have the same interest in cosmetics and fashion, which are today touted as indispensable for beauty. To buttress this myth, it is claimed that fashion beauty has prevailed throughout all ages of history and for all classes of women. As evidence, the fashion mongers point to the fact that even in primitive society, women painted and decorated their bodies. To explode this myth, let us briefly review the history of cosmetics and fashion. In primitive society, where sexual competition did not exist, there was no need for cosmetics and fashions as artificial aids to beauty. The bodies and faces of both men and women were painted and decorated, but not for the sake of beauty. These customs arose out of a different set of needs connected with primitive life and labor. It was necessary at that time for each individual who belonged to the kinship group to be marked as such, as well as by sex and age categories. These marks included not only ornaments, rings, bracelets, short skirts, etc., but also gashes, incisions, tattoo marks, and different kinds of body painting. They indicated not only the sex of each individual, but the changing age and labor status of the members of the community as they matured from children to adults and elders. Rather than decorations, these markings can be viewed as the primitive way of keeping the life history of each individual, which in our society is kept in family albums. And since primitive society was communistic, these markings also tokened complete social equality. Then came class society. The marks that signified, among other things, social equality in primitive society became transformed into their opposite. They became fashions and decorations that signified social inequality. Expressions of the division of society into rich and poor, into rulers and subjugated. Cosmetics and fashions began as the prerogative of the aristocracy. A good illustration can be found in the French court before the French Revolution. Among the kings, princes, and landed gentry, both men and women were dressed in the height of fashion. They were dandies, with their painted faces, powdered hair, lace ruffles, gilded ornaments, and the rest. Both sexes were quote-unquote beautiful, according to the standards of the day. But more decisively, both sexes in the ruling classes were demarcated by their cosmetics and fashions from the poor peasants who sweated for them on the land and who were, by the same standards, not beautiful. Fashion at that period was the mark of class distinction, embracing both sexes of the privileged class against both sexes of the working class. Then, when bourgeois customs supplanted feudal practices for certain historical reasons, men left the field of fashion primarily to the women. The big businessmen established their class standing through the fashions of their wives, and in other ways, and left off wearing gold pants and lace ruffles. Among women, however, fashion still marked the distinction between Judy O'Grady and the Colonel's Lady. I think that must be a reference that I'm not understanding, but it sounds funny. Judy O'Grady and the Colonel's Lady. If anyone knows what that's from, let me know. As capitalism developed, there arose an enormous expansion of the productive machine, and along with it the need for a mass market. Since women constitute half of the population, profiteers in female beauty began to exploit it. And so the fashion field was gradually expanded out of the narrow confines of the rich and eventually imposed upon the whole female population. To serve the needs of this big sector of big business, class distinctions were papered over and concealed behind sex identity. The hired advertising hucksters began grinding out the propaganda. All women want to be beautiful. Therefore, all women have the same stake in cosmetics and fashion. High fashion became identical with beauty, and all women were sold on their common needs and wants for the purchasable aids to beauty. Today, billions in profits are coined out of every department in the beauty field: cosmetics, clothes, hairdos, slenderizing salons, beauty salons, jewelry, fake and real, and so on. Beauty, it was discovered, was a very flexible formula. All an enterpriser had to do to become rich was to discover a new aid to beauty and convince masses of women that they quote-unquote needed and quote-unquote wanted this aid. See any Revlon ad. To maintain and expand this bonanza, it was necessary to disseminate certain other myths through the propaganda machine at the disposal of the profiteers. These are as follows. 1. Women from time immemorial have been competing with other women for sexual attention from the men. This is virtually a biological law from which there is no escape, and since it has existed for all time and will continue to exist for all time, women must submit to their fate and forever compete with each other in the capitalist sex market. 2. In modern society, the natural beauty of women does not really count. Indeed, it is insinuated nature has really abandoned the female sex in the realm of beauty. To make up for their natural homeliness and disfigurements, they must resort to artificial aids, which the kind profiteers have placed at their disposal. Let us examine this propaganda. Sex competition, natural or social? A study of the sciences of biology and anthropology discloses that sex competition amongst females does not exist either in nature or in primitive society. It is exclusively the product of class society and was unknown before class society came into existence, which means for almost 1 million years of human evolution. Throughout the animal world, there is no such thing as sex competition among females for attention from males. The only sex competition that prevails in the animal world is that which is imposed by nature upon the male sex, who fight one another for access to the females. This is simply nature's way of assuring perpetuation of the species. But because of its disruptive effects upon social cooperation, this feature of male sexual competition was eradicated in the formation and consolidation of the first social organization, which was a system of primitive communism. This absence of sex competition among females in nature was one of the reasons women were able to lead in the creation of that original social system. The social order they created to serve their needs was precisely one that was free from disruptive competitive relations. The absence of sex competition or jealousy among primitive women is unchallenged even by many conservative anthropologists, although they view it often as surprise, as a savage peculiarity or quaint custom. Then came class society, founded upon the acquisition and competitive spirit, together with the degradation of women into dependency upon men, along with the competitive struggle for property and wealth among men. There arose a competitive struggle among women for wealthy and powerful men. But this social affliction of sexual competition imposed upon women has nothing natural about it. It is exclusively artificial, as in historically created and conditioned. Sex competition among women arose with the emergence of the sex or marriage quote-unquote market. The sex market is part and parcel of the commodity market as a whole, which is fundamental to capitalist class society. With the expansion of sex as a commodity, the standard of female beauty became gradually transformed from natural to artificial or fashionable beauty. This process has reached its peak in contemporary society. In the earliest period of barter exchange, women were bartered for cattle and the cattle for women. The natural beauty and health of women was then at a premium in the same way and for the same reasons that the natural health of cattle was at a premium. Both were necessary and desirable in the productive and reproductive life of the community, with the healthiest and most beautiful specimens best able to carry out their functions. Then, with the consolidation of the patriarchy in class society, certain women were accumulated by rich men as one form of all the different kinds of property they were accumulating. The custom arose of embellishing these wives and concubines with decorations and ornaments in the same way and for the same reasons that palaces were decorated and ornamented. This reached its apex in the Asiatic palaces and harems as sexual property of the prince or khan. The more he possessed of these luxury articles, the more he gave evidence of his standing as a wealthy potentate. I haven't heard that word in so long. At this stage, sex competition amongst women was overshadowed by the competition amongst men for such property accumulations. The women themselves were chattels or commodities. As monogamy displaced polygamy, and property considerations became the basis of marriage, wealthy women had the advantage over poor women in sex competition. A rich heiress, regardless of her beauty and health, made a desirable wife to a man accumulating property and vice versa. A man would prefer, if he had the choice, the more beautiful woman, for property considerations usually came first. These marriages, involving property mergers, were conducted in business-like fashion between the families of the pair and had only incidental reference to the wishes and desires of the individuals involved. This type of marriage, conducted through family negotiations or a marriage broker, remained in force generally throughout the long agricultural period when property was primarily landed property. Then came capitalism, money relations, and quote-unquote free enterprise. This brought free enterprise not only in competitive free labor and in business competition, but also in female sex competition. Among the wealthy, it is true, marriage mergers continued as a form of property mergers, and the two were often indistinguishable. Indeed, with the rise of monopoly capitalism, the two kinds of mergers narrowed the ruling plutocrats down to America's 60 families. But in America, which was basically bourgeois from the birth, certain peculiarities arose. Class lines could be transgressed by a man of money, unlike feudal Europe where class distinctions were established at birth. Thus, in the heyday of capitalism, a worker or a middle-class man here could, by fluke or fortune, become rich and thereby change his class status. Similarly with a woman. Through accident or even beauty, a woman might marry a millionaire and change her class status. This Cinderella fairy tale, American capitalist style, is most graphically illustrated by Bobo Rockefeller, the miner's daughter, who married and then divorced with a multi-million-dollar alimony settlement, one of America's richest men. Good for her. These peculiarities of American life prepared the social psychological ground for the mass commodity market, just as sex market and mass sex competition among females, just as the Horatio Alger stories became the handbook for men on how to rise from rags to riches, so the romance stories for women told them how to get and marry the boss's son or even the boss himself. All she had to do was rush to the beauty market and buy all the commodities guaranteed to transform Cinderella into a princess. The cosmetics and fashion world became a capitalist gold mine with virtually unlimited possibilities. Businessmen in these fields had only to change the fashions often enough and invent more and newer aids to beauty to become richer and richer. That is how, under modern capitalism, the sale of women as commodities was displaced by the sale of commodities to women. Correspondingly, the myth was disseminated that beauty depends on fashion, and that all women have identical fashion needs because they all have identical beauty needs. Profiteers in female flesh. There are three main gangs of profiteers who batten off the mass of women they dragoon or wheedle into pouring out money in their search for beauty. Those who profit by the those who profit by the manipulation of female flesh into the current standardized fashion size and mold. 2. Those who paint and emulsify this manipulated flesh with cosmetics, dyes, lotions, perfumes, etc. 3. Those who decorate the manipulated and painted flesh with high fashion clothes, jewelries, etc. This is important. This is quite a read here. In the first category, a woman to be beautiful must be of a certain size, weigh so much and not an ounce more or less, and have a certain arbitrary hip, bust, and waist measurements. If she varies from this mechanical pattern, she is not beautiful. This causes enormous suffering to women who vary from this assembly line ordeal. Weighed down and frustrated by the real burdens of life under capitalism, whose source they do not understand, working women especially tend to view their imaginary disfigurements as the source of their troubles. They become victims of inferiority complexes, and so they flock by the thousands and tens of thousands and millions to the manipulators and decorators of female flesh, pouring their hard-earned money into the coffers of these profiteers. Damn. Through Hollywood stars and beauty contests, these fleshly standards are maintained and ballyhooed. Selected beauties are paraded before the hypnotized eyes of the great mass of women through every available means, in the movies, on television, in the slick and pulp magazines. But the monotonous uniformity of these beauties is appalling. And she puts beauties in quotation marks, quote unquote beauties, because we all know they're fucking hideous. What is held up as beauty in this culture is fucking hideous. If you ever see like some of these women in person, like not to be insulting, but what I am saying is that it's an illusion, and a lot can be done to portray a certain image on certain faces. Not that it matters that they're beautiful or not, but what happens to them in their faces and bodies is grotesque, and it makes it's not beautiful. It's appalling. But the monotonous uniformity of these beauties is appalling. Every vestige of variety, the keynote of real beauty, has been erased. They could just as well be so many sugar cookies stamped out of the same dough with the same molds. In the next category are the cosmetic dealers, dyers, and emulsifiers of this regimented flesh. Perhaps only the workers in the factories of these manufacturers know that the same cheap raw materials which go into a $10 jar or bottle of this and that also go into the 50-cent bottle or jar in the dime store. To the naive and innocent, however, the $10 jar must contain some special, potent magic that is not contained in the cheap item. The big ads say so, and so it must be true. These poor women strain their financial resources to get this magic product, hoping this will transform them from clerks to heiresses. Finally, with the fashion profiteers, an agonizing choice is placed before the women. Shall they buy for durability or for a passing fad? The rich, who can do both, have ordained a round-the-clock fashion circus, fashions for mornings, afternoons, cocktails, evening, night, and bedtime. They have different fashions for every occasion, and there are endless occasions. In addition, a vast collateral assemblage of accessories are required to go with whatever they are supposed to go with. And all this mountain of fashions pressed upon women, one week can, the next week, month, or season, be declared obsolete through a new fashion decree, a good example of whether women get what they need or whether they are compelled to need what they can get. I'm sorry, let me reread that. A good example of whether women can get what they need or whether they are compelled to need what they can be found in an article published in the New York Times. It pointed out that Christian Dior, the famous courtier of the rich, whose styles are copied in cheap versions for the poor, had the power to raise the skirts of 50 million American women overnight, or lower them, or both. A difference of 3 or 4 inches in a hemline can be a disaster for women who feel the pressure to look fashionable at work. It may be fun for the rich to throw out their wardrobes and get new ones, but it is exceedingly costly for the poor. Thus, when it is contended that women have the right to use cosmetics, fashions, etc., without clearly distinguishing between such a right and the social compulsion to submit to this exploitation, it leads straight into the trap of capitalist propaganda and practices. Women of the vanguard, leading in the effort for social change, must never, even unwittingly, reinforce this fashion rat race. Their job is to expose the scoundrels who profit from such victimization of women. Oh my goodness. I think this is interesting in that you're here and we're talking about this because, I mean, one of the really compelling things about what's happening with the South Korean feminist movement is the rejection of these practices, being off corset. And that's not, I haven't seen it in any other nations to that extent. So, I mean, this is serious. And I mean, while women have through history have critiqued it and been this is bullshit, it's just interesting. There seems to be a lot of difficulty with follow through on it. And I don't know. It's I think that part of that is speaking to how I think a lot of women feel like change is impossible for them. And that they have to do these things. And it's so horrible. It's so horrible. It really is. It's also just such a waste of your resources. And women don't have enough. Opposition, not opposition, not adaptation. It is contended that, so long as capitalism prevails, we women must abide by these cosmetic and fashion decrees. Otherwise, we will be left behind in the economic and social rear. It is true that to hold jobs in offices, and for other reasons, we must at least give token recognition of the harsh reality. But that does not mean that we should accept these arbitrary and expensive compulsions and edicts complacently or without protest. Workers in the plants are often obliged to accept speed-ups, pay cuts, and attacks on their unions, but the militants accept them under protest and continue to struggle against them in movements that counterpose their needs and will against their exploiters. The class struggle is a movement of opposition, not adaptation, and this should hold true not only of the workers in the factories, but of women as well, both working women and housewives. It is because the issues are far more obscure in the realm of women as a sex that some have fallen into the trap of adaptation. In this respect, we must change our course. Let us explain that the modern fashion standards of beauty are not a permanent fixture, and that working women can and should have something to say about them. We can point out, for example, that the use of cosmetics is a fairly recent innovation. In the past century, a woman in search of a husband lessened her chances of getting him if she applied cosmetics. At that time, cosmetics was the badge of the prostitute, and no respectable man would marry a painted woman. Again, in women's clothes, some sweeping changes took place as a result of the large numbers of women entering industry and offices during and after World War I. They cast off their whalebone corsets, the 16 starched petticoats, big pompadours, and bigger hats, and adopted clothes more suited to their working needs. The attractive, casual garments of today, which grew up out of these needs of the working women, were then taken over by the rich women for their sports and play. Recently, even the proletarian denim cloth of dungarees of the factory worker have become socially elevated. Perhaps the rich women, nettled by the sexually attractive appearance of women in overalls and sweaters, decided to adapt them to life in the suburbs and on their fancy estates. In this attack on the fashion racket, I am not speaking against attractive clothes, nor resisting any necessary or desirable changes in the kind of clothes we want to wear. New times, new productive and social conditions will bring changes of all kinds. What I am against is the fashion rat race and the inordinate amount of time, attention, and money consumed by it. Time is the most precious of all raw materials, for time is life. We have better things to do with our lives than dissipate them in this costly, vulgar, and depressing frenzy of keeping up with fashions. Under socialism, the question of whether or not a woman wishes to paint and decorate her body will be of no more social consequence than the painting up on Halloween and other festive occasions of children today, or the painting up of actors for the stage or clowns for the circus. Some women may regard themselves as more beautiful when they are so painted, some may not. But this will be a purely personal opinion and nothing more. There will be no more economic or social compulsion for all women to submit to these practices. Therefore, let us not defend the hucksters who tout this commercial exploitation of women in the name of quote-unquote beauty. The massive propaganda machine. In recent years, more and more attention has been directed towards the female population as important buyers of consumer goods of all kinds: homes and home furnishings, cars, refrigerators, family apparel, maternity needs, and so on. Many of these products are necessary and useful, and as such, do not need to be sold through high-pressure advertising, which adds to their cost. But under the anarchistic system of capitalism, with its enormous and wasteful duplication of products, the various manufacturers compete with one another for a larger share of this lucrative market. Thus, the advertising industry, a parasitic adjunct to big business, has itself grown into another branch of big business. All the mass media, radio, television, and the press, which influence and mold public opinion, are built around and supported by the advertisers who are supported by the capitalist merchandisers. All these wings of big business not only push the sale of commodities, they are also cogs in the massive propaganda machine which disseminates the required ideology and psychology for maintaining the capitalist system and its powers of exploitation. Women already weighed down with numerous conflicts and frustrations are highly susceptible to this psychological manipulation which directs them to the purchase of things as the solution to their problems. In addition to the general press, a growing number of magazines are directed exclusively to women, especially in the fields of fashions and aids to beauty. These are handsome productions printed on the finest of slick papers, but the contents are also slick, for they sell not only beauty by the bucket and other profitable merchandise, but also a highly effective sales motivator that the women who purchase the most are the most happy and successful of women. In the glamorous ads, we see enticing photos of luscious commodities of all kinds alongside beautiful women. The great American dream comes true for beautiful women who can purchase the streamlined cars, television sets, and whatnot. But even, it seems, a dreamy sex life and an ideal family. Those who fail to acquire all these things wonder what is the matter with them as women, that they have been dispossessed from this great American dream. They blame themselves for not having been born rich and beautiful. This sense of personal inferiority is further implemented by the stories and articles which fill the spaces between the big advertisements. Writers capable of exposing the capitalist source of this sense of defeat suffered by the masses of women are not invited to disseminate their views in these slick magazines. The scientific, quote-unquote, scientific opinions peddled in them are designed to uphold and not undermine the capitalist exploitation of women. Thus, the specialists of various kinds, who are hired to write articles for anxious housewives, lecture them on the need for more child care, mother love, family attention, all of which it is clear can be supplied through extensive and expensive purchases, or they discuss problems connected with career women, often leaving the insidious hint that their happy homes and emotional lives are being endangered by their outside work. Here again, it seems that the danger can be averted through more purchasing. In pitting the working woman against the housewife mother, and vice versa, both sets of women are left with feelings of guilt, conflict, and frustration. This is magnified in the case of those who are both working women and housewives. They are perpetually torn by a conflict of interest they cannot resolve. But all of this distress and sense of defeat suffered by women is extremely beneficial to the profiteers. It tends to send some women into fresh purchasing sprees in an effort to overcome their anxieties and sense of failure. Very often, as a quick restorative of their self-confidence, they rush to buy a new fashion or some magic item of beauty in a bottle. In short, first the capitalist system degrades and oppresses the great mass of women. Then it exploits the discontents and fears in women to stoke the fires of unlimited sales and profits. Our task, therefore, is to expose both the capitalist system as the source of these evils and its massive propaganda machine, which tells gullible women that the road to a successful life and love is through the purchase of things. To condone or accept capitalist standards in any field, from politics to cosmetics, is to prop up and perpetuate this ruthless profit system and its continued victimization of women. the pretending to be normal comment is rather interesting. I think that's a really slick way that women end up portraying ourselves very easily. It's just like, it does get exhausting being the only one sometimes that sticks out. But I also think, the more you stick out, the more you like find those situations that you're in where you have to conform to be intolerable. I mean, and I think it's important to, be ourselves and be true to ourselves before anything else. Life is what we make of it. And if we're not being true to ourselves, we're ultimately like hurting ourselves. Transhumanist Cult Awareness Network says that her ex-boyfriend once sent an email with a list of hair removal recommendations. Ugh. Men are horrible. But, oh, God. The fucking audacity. The nerve. Like, ugh. I have to be honest, I'm feeling a little tired, so I might skip through this last section, which is the feminine mystique, but I do want to touch on it. And this was written, this is a reprint from the winter 1964 printing of the International Socialist Review. So this will be interesting. It's a 1964. The Feminine Mystique is an outstanding sociological study, an overdue challenge to the mercenary myth-makers who have invented the glorified image of the happy housewife heroine and imposed it upon American women. The author, a mother of 3 children, analyzes the plight of women like herself who belong to the privileged upper middle strata of American society. Most women have no choice except to be tied to a household or chained to a factory or office job or both. But the women that Betty Friedan examines are more fortunate. They have access to all the advantages of our culture: education, scholarship, interesting and well-paid paying professions, and yet most of them have forfeited development of their higher capacities to enroll in the ranks as listed as occupation housewife. Exposed by the author are the realities behind the show windows of suburbia where female residents suffer agonies from a problem that has no name. This is their inability to adjust to their narrow, stultifying sphere of existence. She also describes the catastrophic consequences that this debasement of women inflicts upon the whole family. Few escape the pathology flowing from the feminine mystique. Betty Friedan's findings have a wider relevance than the well-to-do housewives she has investigated. These set the pattern of behavior and aspiration for working-class housewives, who mistakenly believe that because middle-class women have all the advantages, they also have all the answers. In this way, distorted ideas and values seep down to infect masses of women, including some working women, who wonder whether they might not lead a better life as a full-time housewife. This book should help settle their doubts. Springing Old Trap. The Feminine Mystique is a modernized version of the old formula for domestic enslavement, more bluntly expressed as woman's place is in the home. Trying to move this over so I can get a better shot here. Woman's place is in the home. The new element is the poison bait of the mystique by which women today are voluntarily lured back into the trap that their grandmothers fought to escape from. Oh well. Betty Friedan reminds us that in the 19th century and in the first decades of the 20th, progressive middle-class women led an inspiring feminist struggle for women's rights. Out of this rebellion, they won the right to higher education, participation in production, professional careers, independent ownership of property, and the vote. These reforms were an immense improvement over their previous chatteldom, and could have been a springboard to further advances to full human stature and dignity. Instead, the Second World War and its aftermath brought a sweeping setback characterized by the author as a counter-revolution against women. The call for this retreat was sounded by Farnham and Lundberg's book Modern Woman, The Lost Sex, published in 1942. The lost women were the independent ones interested in science, art, politics, and engaged in careers beyond the family circle. In place of intelligent, creative, public-spirited women came the new image of the feminine woman, the empty-headed housewife, contented within the cozy walls of a pretty home. As the mystique gained momentum, domesticity became a religion, a pattern by which all women must now live or deny their femininity, writes the author. What began as a trek back to the old corral became a stampede during the prosperity of the 1950s. To mobilize women behind their own defeat, facts about the pioneer fighters for women's rights were distorted, although most of the feminist crusaders had husbands, children, and homes. They were depicted as embittered, sex-starved spinsters, incapable of fulfilling their femininity as wives and mothers. Among the unforgivable traits of these spirited women was their enjoyment of participation in the struggle for social change. Also blacked out of the record was the ultra-reactionary source of this retreat back into the home. It was Hitler in the 1930s who enforced the notorious 3Ks for women: Kinder, Kuch, and Kirch. Children, cooking, and church. By the 1940s, a similar slogan was sold to American women in the disguised, glamorized package of the feminine mystique. The author likens the blind docility with which middle-class women accepted their fate to prisoners in Nazi concentration camps, who became unprotesting, walking corpses, marching to their own doom. In a sense, that is not as far-fetched as it sounds. The women who adjust as housewives, who grow up wanting to be just a housewife, are in as much danger as the millions who walked to their own death in the concentration camps, and the millions more who refused to believe that the concentration camps existed. True, the barbed wire surrounding the comfortable concentration camps of suburbia was invisible. What was visible to these victims of the American dream were the gilded trappings of the standard middle-class home. As a lifetime occupation, however, they were bogged down in a domestic trivia requiring the intellectual exertions of an 8-year-old. Even then, there was not enough work to occupy their full time. Thus, housework expanded to fill the time available, as the inmates squandered their energies in more frantic, busy work on meaningless details. Working women can usually polish off in an hour the chores on which full-time housewives spend 6 hours and still leave unfinished at dinner time. Even with all the new labor-saving appliances, the author points out, the modern American housewife probably spends more time on housework than her grandmother. I don't know this. anyone knows how to pronounce this name, let me know in the comments section. Like Diogenes with his lamp, Betty Friedan went in search of at least one intelligent, capable woman who felt fulfilled as a full-time housewife. She found none. What she didn't find, out of a sample of at least 28 women in an upper-income community, was the following. 16 out of the 28 were in analysis or analytical psychotherapy. 18 were taking tranquilizers. Several had tried suicide. And some had been hospitalized for varying periods for depression or vaguely diagnosed psychotic states. You'd be surprised at the number of these happy suburban housewives who simply go berserk one night and run shrieking through the street without any clothes on, said the local doctor, not a psychiatrist, who had been called in such emergencies. 12 were engaged in extramarital affairs, in fact or in fantasy. It was this conflict of reality with the widely publicized image of the happy housewife which caused Betty Friedan to break the hypnosis of the mystique in her own life, asking the key question, what made these women go home again? She then proceeded to collect the data which explained how the trick was done. Office work seemed like hell for women. It sounds like being a fucking housewife in an office. I mean, offices can be very different, but the brainwashers. A high-powered propaganda machine was put into motion to exalt housewifery and stifle women's desires for something more than a husband, home, and children. Beginning with the sex-directed educators in the schools and colleges, this campaign has penetrated into every avenue of mass indoctrination. The key word in this technique of thought control, as effective as a blackjack on the skull in a dark alley, is the word feminine. College girls, terrified lest they lose their femininity through any display of brains or serious study, learn to camouflage their intelligence or obediently empty their minds altogether. Their main preoccupation, fostered by parents and educators alike, is the pursuit of a wedding ring. As one educator put it, college for women was the world's best marriage mart. Higher education for women was readjusted to fit the new goal. It became a veneer for suburban wifehood. Courses in advanced cooking, in marriage and family adjustment displaced courses in chemistry, physics, etc. Old-fashioned educators, repelled by the sophisticated soup dished up as liberal arts courses, were brought into line or pushed aside. Even such Ivy League colleges as Vassar, Smith, Barnard, and others, which pioneered higher education for women in America and were noted for their uncompromising intellectual standards, tumbled from their heights. And on they go. As the spokesman of a famous women's college put it, we are not educating women to be scholars. We are educating them to be wives and mothers. With commendable irony, the girls promptly abbreviated this to WHAM. Summing up the consequences of this deterioration in education, the author writes, Sex-directed education segregated recent generations of able American women, as surely as separate but equal education segregated able American Negroes from the opportunity to realize their full abilities in the mainstream of American life. Along with this lowering of educational standards, the age level for marriage took a sharp plunge, often beginning even in high schools. While the birth rate soared, the fashion for whammism swept up the nation, spearheaded by middle-class women who led all the others in the race to have more babies. The average age of first marriage in the last 15 years has dropped to the youngest in history in this country, the youngest in any of the countries of the Western world, almost as young as it used to be in the so-called underdeveloped countries. The annual rate of population increase in the U.S. is among the highest in the world, nearly 3 times that of the Western European nations, nearly double Japan's, and close on the heels of Africa and India. Sustaining and extending this redirection of women are the powerful molders of public opinion, editors and writers of the slick magazines for women, newspaper columnists, TV shows, movies, popular novels, pulps, and all the rest. Insidiously and unremittingly, they warn women that even yearning to express their intellects and talents would be heavily paid for by the loss of their femininity. The social sciences, applied sociology, psychology, and anthropology are likewise misused to buttress this feminine mystique. Even alert and intelligent women find it difficult to question propaganda when it is disguised as science. Let's read that again. Even alert and intelligent women find it difficult to question propaganda when it is disguised as science. The more dubious findings of the eminent psychologist Freud are perverted and vulgarized to lend authority to the theme that women's place is in the home. For reasons far removed from the life of Freud himself, Freudian thought has become the ideological bulwark of the sexual counter-revolution in America, says Betty Friedan. For example, penis envy became a psychological catch-all, the answer to women's resentments against their inferior status. It was invoked as a bludgeon against such unfeminine demands as freedom and equality with men. The noted functional anthropologist Margaret Mead, perhaps unwittingly, has been one of the most influential contributors to the pseudoscientific campaign propping up the feminine mystique. According to this major architect of opinion about women, it is the entrances and exits of the body which are decisive in shaping the individual in society. Utilizing bits and patches of Freud's teachings, she returned from the South Seas, where she charted tribal personality according to literal oral and anal tribes, bringing women the good news that in their bodily organs they are, after all, the equals of men. Since women possess the supremely feminine entrance, the vagina, the equality of women stems from the fact that for every penis there is a uterus. She equated those assertive, creative, productive aspects of life on which the superstructure of a civilization depends with the penis, and defined feminine creativity in terms of the passive receptivity of the uterus, says the author. Thus, through her influence, procreation became a cult, a career, to the exclusion of every other kind of a creative endeavor. Ironically, Margaret Mead did not guide her own life by what she wrote in her books. As Betty Friedan points out, she demonstrated feminine capabilities that go far beyond childbirth. She made her way in a man's world without denying that she was a woman. But not until recent years has Margaret Mead modified her position and begun to chide women, as well as their over-domesticated husbands, for too much preoccupation with home and family. However, all these educators, scientists, and other molders of public opinion are not independent thinkers. They are themselves molded by the controllers of our economy and directly or indirectly serve their needs. Paramount among these, of course, is the need for expanding sales and greater profits. The sexual cell. Betty Friedan generously says that the sexual cell in consumer goods is not the result of an economic conspiracy by big business. However, she presents ample evidence that the profiteers are the main movers and prime beneficiaries of the immense apparatus generating the drive toward keeping women in the home. Women are the major buyers of things for the home and its intimates. Thus, as the author points out, I just lost my spot. Thus, as the author points out, in all the talk of femininity and women's role, one forgets that the real business in America is business. To step up the sale of things and more things through rapidly changing fashions is the job of the commercial advertising and sales promotion agencies. Women's weaknesses are carefully studied and ruthlessly exploited by the most unscrupulous members of the Madison Avenue brainwashers, the manipulators in depth, taking advantage of the knowledge that most housewives are restless, unhappy, and bored. The depth boys have come up with magic formulas promising feminine fulfillment through the purchase of things. The endlessly hungry women who do not understand that they are really starved for means of expressing their productive social, cultural, and intellectual potential become easy prey for this gigantic sales swindle. Since her own identity as a human being has collapsed, writes Betty Friedan, she needs these external trappings to buttress her emptiness of self, to make her feel like somebody. One of the chief professional motivators, who is paid about $1 million a year for his services, told the author how cunningly this fraud is perpetrated. Properly manipulated, if you are not afraid to say that word, American housewives can be given a sense of identity, purpose, creativity, the self-realization, even the sexual joy they lack by the buying of things. In a free enterprise economy, we have to develop the need for new products, and to do that, we have to liberate women to desire these new products. This can be manipulated. We sell them what they ought to want, speed up the unconscious, move it along. The manufacturer wants her back into the kitchen, and we show him how to do it the right way. If he tells her all she can be is a wife and mother, she will spit in his face. But we show him how to tell her that it's creative to be in the kitchen. We liberate her to be creative in the kitchen. Nero, back off. Come on, kitty. I'm almost done. To stimulate the housewife into becoming a passionate thing buyer, the depth boys overstimulate her appetites for food, sex, and procreation. Thus, the slick magazines feature dramatic full-page color spreads of gargantuan vegetables, beets, cucumbers, green peppers, potatoes, not to speak of succulent roasts dripping with gravy and fluffy pies and cakes. In a large-sized print, usually reserved for a first-grade primer, foods are described like a love affair. This oral satisfaction requires, in turn, the buying of the right home with a gorgeous kitchen, sometimes decorated with mosaic murals and original paintings, equipped with gleaming electric mixers, red stoves with rounded corners, and all the other paraphernalia and gadgets that subtly tie in status with stomach. Sexual gratification is likewise promised in glamour ads, featuring lipstick and hair dyes, high-fashion clothes, perfumes, chrome-plated cars, and the like. The sacred joys of procreation demand a great diversity of products, from pink and blue, toy-filled nurseries to Dr. Spock's current baby Bible. Through some oversight, that bodily exit, the anus, is least imaginatively treated. Soft toilet tissue is still toilet paper, even if it comes in 4 different colors and white. If, after all their frenzied purchasing, the results do not stack up with the promises, the housewives are invited to slake their thirst with salt water. They can double and triple their purchases of things, but as the author points out, women have minds and capacities that food, sex, or procreation by themselves cannot satisfy. And those who think that their discontents can be removed by more money, a bigger house, 2 fireplaces instead of 1, 3 cars, another baby, moving to a better suburb, often discover it gets worse. The feminine mystique plays a big role in supporting the consumer market as Cold War propaganda does in the domain of producers' goods. Commenting on the explosive sales boom of the fabulous 50s, the author writes, "It would take a clever economist to figure out what would keep our affluent economy going if the housewife market began to fall off. Just as an economist would have to figure out what to do if there were no threat of war. In short, just as the merchants of death prosper by exploiting the menace of communism on foreign fronts, the merchants of the mystique get rich by exploiting the menace of unfemininity on the home front. But the real menace, which lies below the level of general consciousness, is the dehumanization of the American people, a process that affects not only the housewife but sucks the whole family into the vortex." The vortex. The purchase of things, even a mountain of junk, fails to produce the happy family of togetherness pictured by the advertisers. On the contrary, family relationships degenerate into relationships among owners of things. There are many millions of impoverished women who are deprived of the necessary things that would make their lives more bearable and fruitful. But among these surfeited middle-class women, the possession of things possesses them and impoverishes their personalities. When the wife is reduced to a thing buyer, the husband becomes a thing around the house, who justifies his own frantic activities in the rat race by claiming it's all necessary for the wife and kiddies. The children, too, become converted into living possessions in a home filled with ornaments of all kinds. Unable to understand, much less articulate, the real source of their resentments, husbands and wives, parents and children, become alienated from one another, often blaming one another for their stunted lives. Most desperate are those housewives who have abandoned attempts to kill all their time with housework, but they seek for relief in the wrong direction. Some, guided by the all-pervasive exaltation of sex, become the sex seekers inside or outside of marriage, but the more aggressive they become in the pursuit of sexual bliss, the less they find what they are seeking. Betty Friedan sums up the faceless, depersonalized sex-seeking of today as follows. Instead of fulfilling the promise of infinite orgiastic bliss, sex in the America of the feminine mystique is becoming a strangely joyless national compulsion, if not a contemptuous mockery. The sex-glutted novels becoming increasingly explicit and increasingly dull. The sex kick of the women's magazine has a sickly sadness. An endless flow of manuals describing new sex techniques hint at an endless lack of excitement. This sexual boredom is betrayed by the ever-growing size of the Hollywood starlet's breast, by the sudden emergence of the male phallus as an advertising gimmick. Sex has become depersonalized, seen in terms of these exaggerated symbols. But of all the strange sexual phenomena that have appeared in the era of the feminine mystique, the most ironic are these. The frustrated sexual hunger of American women has increased, and their conflicts over femininity have intensified, as they have reverted from independent activity in search for their soul fulfillment through their sexual role in the home, and as American women have turned their attention to the exclusive, explicit, and aggressive pursuit of sexual fulfillment, or the acting out of sexual fantasy. The sexual interest of American men and their hostility toward women have also increased. The sellers, it seems, have sexed the sex out of sex. Other housewives turn toward their own children as the closest and most malleable means for relieving their dissatisfactions. For the woman who lives through her children, mother love becomes converted into smother love. Even worse, women who are robbed of normal adult relationships carry on what amounts to love affairs with their children. The more susceptible young males can be virtually destroyed in the process. Women and boys comprise the majority of patients in the psychiatric clinics. Oh. Oof. I mean, I think we've all seen that kind of thing that can happen to women where they just like fall in love with their sons, and it's just like, it's so destructive. Ugh. Girls brought up under the influence of the feminine mystique are likewise vulnerable to becoming emotionally arrested at an infantile level. Those who marry young become the transmission belt for conveying this infantilism to their own children. Betty Friedan calls this progressive dehumanization. Equally damaging is the parasitism encouraged in the middle-class homes where everything is done for the children, everything supervised for their comfort and pleasure, down to the curl of their hair. The advertisers feed this indulgence with sales campaigns directed at the gimme kids. This excessive pampering is imitated by better-income working-class parents who are deluded into believing this is giving their own children the best. But in homes where the living is easy, the children tend to grow up soft, passive, lazy, and incompetent, unable to organize a program of serious study and work, and lacking ambition to achieve maturity. They seek to fill up their vacant time with kicks. As the author writes, a questionnaire revealed that there was literally nothing these kids felt strongly enough about to die for, as there was nothing they actually did in which they felt really alive. Ideas, the conceptual thought which is uniquely human, were completely absent from their minds or lives. God. This stuff is still happening. That's the thing. Like, this is still a part of American culture. This absence of vital purpose, this indifference to human values, was noted by army doctors and psychologists who studied GI prisoners of the Korean War. Many of them, unlike their Yankee forebears, lost all resourcefulness, became inert, uncommunicative, did nothing to help their sick comrades, and even cast others out in the snow to die. Such dehumanized behavior, opined one doctor, was the result of some new failure in the childhood and adolescent training of our young men. Social connections. Betty Friedan connects all the consequences of the flight back to home and family with a predominant state of conservatism and loss of interest in public affairs and social struggles. What happened to women is part of what happened to all of us in the years after the war. We found excuses for not facing the problems we once had the courage to face. The American spirit fell into a strange sleep, men as well as women, scared liberals, disillusioned radicals, conservatives, bewildered and frustrated by change. The whole nation stopped growing up. All of us went back to the warm brightness of home. It was easier, safer to think about love and sex than about communism, McCarthy, and the uncontrolled bomb. It was easier to look for Freudian sexual roots in man's behavior, his ideas, and his wars, than to look critically at his society and his society and act constructively to right its wrongs. There was a kind of personal retreat, even on the part of the most far-sighted, the most spirited. We lowered our eyes from the horizon and steadily contemplated our own navels. This is certainly true, but what is the alternative to total submersion into family life? Betty Friedan's diagnosis of the disease is superior to her remedy for it. She suggests that more serious education and study, together with interesting, well-paying jobs will open the door of the trap. This is merely the same kind of limited individual solution that the feminists formally proposed, and that subsequently proved so ineffective. Some fortunate women can do what the author has done, turn around, make a new life plan, and escape the domestic cage. But the life plans for the great majority of women are determined, for them, by forces outside their personal control, the ruling powers. The sickness that Betty Friedan describes with so much penetration and courage are the products of a diseased social organism in which the rights, welfare, and opportunities of human beings are subjected to the dictates of the profiteers. During a capitalist war, women can be taken out of their homes by the millions and put to work in the factories. But when they are no longer needed as producers, they are sent back home to become primarily consumers. In both instances, what is decisive is not the needs of women as human beings, but the interests of the monopolists. These masters of America shape the lives and livelihoods of womanhood, and the whole family according to their own corrupt and corrupting aims. Woman's destiny cannot be fundamentally transformed until this truth is understood and acted upon. The feminists of the past could achieve their limited reforms within the framework of a still ascending capitalism. But today it has become a dead-end capitalism. It is good, but not enough for women to become more social-minded, as Betty Friedan advocates. They should now become socialist-minded, because only a root and branch change in the whole venal system can save us all from further dehumanization. What do you all think? I want to thank you for joining me tonight and listening to me read from some of the sections in this book. A lot to think about, isn't there? There's a lot to think about. I'm not sure if you're asking me a question with this, JD. Is the argument we want an autonomous, independent people working to the betterment of the world? What? I don't really understand your question. Do I have a view on Jordan Peterson? Certainly not. I certainly do not have a view on him at all. It seems like there was a lot of conversation going on that I missed while I was reading. Lucky me, I suppose. But a lot of it's very interesting. Leah. Hi, Leah. Why do I think women are so dead set on conforming? I think it's ultimately about fear. I think it's about fear, and I think it's about, I mean, conformity is about fear. Like, there's that quote about women like being taught that the world is flat and that if we go too far, we'll fall off the edge. Like, I don't know if that was Dworkin who said that. If anyone knows. Hey, dude. I think that's what that's about. I think that women like are most of them are in a state of fear and as such like really lack an ability to act, you know. And I think a lot of it is, you know, social isolation. And we've talked about this before on this channel. Social capital is everything for women. If you are not liked, you know, survival's a lot harder. Hey, baby. You were trying to get up here this whole time and I wouldn't let you, would I? You mad at me? You mad at me? Yeah. Ugh. I also think that some of them are just so lost in their own cages that they don't understand that what they're doing is decorating their cage a lot of the time, you know? They think they like what they're doing because they just can't fathom anything else. Yeah. And also, I mean, you know, I think for women, women are judged and valued by our relationships fundamentally. If a woman doesn't have or struggles in terms of like social matters or in relationships, it's a sign of non-femininity. I mean, and I think that's what was interesting about the last two sections of this reading, that really delved into what's wrong with femininity in a lot of ways. I mean, if you're viewed as being difficult and you're viewed as being not good at maintaining relationships because of your, you know, bizarre behaviors that are not feminine, you know, you're viewed as less of a woman, period. And thus you don't get to have as much of a say or like have as much regard in, not only are you not treated like a man by men, but you're also not accepted into women or amongst women as well. And it's like, there's no real place to go then, is there? Most people don't know how to be lone wolves, period. You know, most people do not know how to stand on their own, men and women. Hey, baby. Hey, baby. Hey, baby. Well, I'm going to head out because it's past 10 and I should be quiet. And you all should go to bed too if it's that time for you. And also it's you know, it's winter. So it's a good time to just go to bed in general. Oh, what emotes here. Hi. Hey, come on. Why are you so bitey? Why are you so bitey?
It's interesting. Some women continue to make the effort to come up with looks or tactics that might be attractive to the women who are afraid of falling off for various degrees. That's true too. A lot of women try to like fit in with them as well. Stop, 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 stop.
I mean, style and fashion are very, they're big. A lot of feminine women like stop. Okay, no, no. Like, anyway, I'm gonna stop. Thanks for being here. It's been real, but I should go. So have a good night, have a good day, have a good time. Keep it strange. I'm out.